You're listening to The Mind's Eye. We have on right now Professor Joseph Kelly. We're discussing his book, Marooned, Jamestown, Shipwreck, and a New History of America's Origin. We left off, we were talking about Jamestown and how it was pretty much just a cycle of going up and down. A lot of mainly just being down. They didn't have enough supplies. People were dying. People were leaving, going to the indigenous tribes. So they constantly had to send supplies back to get supplies from England to Jamestown. And they have many boats that come in, and they have ships that come and do this. One such, which we're talking about, which is the main bulk of the story, is the story of the Sea Venture, which was part of the third resupply for Jamestown. Tell us about the Sea Venture and kind of set the scene there for us.
The third resupply of Jamestown is really important because the Virginian Company realized that what was going on in the first couple supplies was not going to succeed. The colony was going to fail if they kept doing what they were doing. They knew this because John Smith sent a scathing letter back with Captain Newport, who was the guy who was commanding the resupply missions. And when he was in Jamestown, Captain Newport, he was pretty much the guy in charge. And then when he left, whoever was president of the council in Jamestown was in charge. And when the second supply came, it was basically all the resources of that second supply went into this mission to try to find gold up in the mountains. And John Smith was just livid about this, a complete squandering and a fool's errand, which it proved to be. So he wrote a letter back to the company talking about how horrible they were in managing the supplies. So, and the company knew things were going wrong anyway, but this letter, I think, put it over the top. And what they decided to do was to double down, or actually, quadruple down. They wanted to send, up to this point, never more than 100 people were really occupying the colony. At, the end of a supply, there might be 100 people. And by the time the next supply came back, it was back down to 50. So we were talking about small numbers of people. What they wanted to do in the third supply is actually send 1,000 people. So they were going to send an entire English town. They were going to recruit carpenters. They're going to recruit smiths. They were going to recruit people who could do mining and could recognize minerals. But they were going to send farmers. They were going to send leather workers. They were advertising to collect all sorts of different professions. They're going to bring women. Women. The first couple of women came in the second supply, but just a couple of them. But this was going to bring women, and then people were going to establish households and have kids. So the colony was going to begin to really resemble what people thought it was going to resemble in the first place, which is like a small English town with farms outlying, surrounding it and that kind of thing. They were able to recruit only about 500 people, not 1,000. They had this gigantic blast propaganda campaign all across England. They got to the point they were raising money too to, of course, supply this gigantic mission. And we have the records of the Candle Makers Guild, the Fishmongers Guild, all gathering their own money. When they come to their annual meeting and they each put in their 20 pence until it adds up to where they can buy a share in the company. So the company raises this tremendous amount of money by selling shares, and a lot of people buying those shares are not just rich people, but they're common people as well, pooling their money. And they succeed in putting together a pretty big fleet. They're going to end up with 9 ships, starting out in London, touching in Plymouth, and then heading out. They slide down the Thames River to great fanfare. There's crowds cheering on the side, the banks of the river. The banners are flying, and for good reason it is. I mean, all of England is looking at this as this is where England is going to get into the empire game. They've had this toehold on the continent, but the hullabaloo generated by that propaganda campaign and the size of this enterprise indicates to everybody England is finally going to become an overseas empire. So the whole country is invested in this thing, literally and figuratively. They start sailing, and they have beautiful, beautiful seas. They're actually experimenting with a northern route, which has not been used before, which is a more direct route. It's going to take about 6 weeks. And if this succeeds, they're going to be able to go back and forth between Jamestown and England 3 times in a year instead of twice a year. So they have wonderful smooth sailing. But what begins to happen on the ships is that the sailors who have been to Jamestown before are talking to the new settlers. And the new settlers begin to get buyer's remorse. They have signed on to this enterprise. They have entered into a contract just like the other settlers have. As a matter of fact, it's a new contract because the Virginia Company recognized that the governing structure for the first 2 years didn't work anymore. So they wrote a second charter, new constitutions for the colony. And the settlers who are going in the third supply have signed on to that constitution. They don't really know what they've signed on for. And the reason they don't know is some things have been kept from them. For instance, if you speak ill of the Virginia Company when you're in Jamestown, you could be executed. Now, we can be pretty sure that the treasurer of the company, what we would think of as the CEO of the Virginia Company, who was enacting these contracts with the settlers at his house in Philpot Lane in London, we can be pretty sure that he did not tell them this. That what you exercise as liberty as Englishmen here in England, you're not going to be able to exercise there. And there's going to be no court of appeals. There's going to be, the governor is essentially going to be a totalitarian despot, and you better hope he's a benevolent despot. They don't know that they're entering into this when they get on the ships, but that's what's happening. And the sailors start explaining things about the conditions of Jamestown. So already they're beginning to question this contract that they've signed onto. And then they sail into a hurricane. They're about a week away from the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, and a hurricane overcomes them. Now, this is one of the things that we have to remember is how extraordinary hurricanes are to the European sensibility in the early 1600s. I live in Charleston, so we're used to it here, and they're still terrifying. And they're still, we suffer hurricanes, and you recognize, oh my God, this is a force of nature like no other. To the European sensibility, hurricanes are not a force of nature. They are a force of the devil. They are an indication that you're sailing into territory that is not ruled by the Gospels. This is terra incognita. So the very fact of the hurricane suggests that you've been abandoned by God. God doesn't reign here. This is how they talk about them. So they sail into this hurricane, and the ships get scattered. The biggest of them, 150 tons, is the Sea Venture, which is has the lion's share of supplies on it. It's got the new governor. It's got the admiral who's in charge of the whole fleet. It's got Captain Newport, the guy who has been to Chesapeake 3 times by this time. So he's the one who really knows, how to navigate. It's got about 120 settlers, probably about 30 sailors, and it's got 2 Indians. It's got a guy named Montauk and Machumps, who are related to the man that we know as Powhatan back in the Chesapeake. They're basically his emissaries to King James's court in England. That ship gets separated from the others. All the other ships, they get demasted, they get injured, people get broken limbs, the sailors are hurt, but they all limp into Chesapeake Bay eventually, one by one. So they get to Jamestown. The Sea Venture does not make it. Everybody else presumes it's lost at sea. That's what they tell the president of the colony in Jamestown. That's what they tell, that word gets sent to England, that the Sea Venture has been lost at sea. But it was not lost at sea. It had been taking on water. Water was seeping right through the very boards of the superstructure of the ship. It got, they're down in the holds with candles looking for where the leaks were. And wherever they found a leak, they would try to pound the oakum, which is the sealant that goes between the beams back into those gaps. When that didn't work, they took salt beef and tried to pound that between the boards to plug the leaks. But nothing happened. They couldn't find all the leaks. Water was, no matter how fast they were pumping and bailing, water was still continuing to come on. So the ship, for 3 days, it fights the storm. Everybody on board settlers, sailors, even the gentlemen have stripped down to their shirts or even stripped naked, and they're fighting the waters. And they get to the point where they decide that they can't fight anymore, and they consign themselves to drowning. And at that moment, the admiral standing up on the poop deck sights land, and he shouts land. And everybody realizes, oh, maybe we are saved. And the admiral is able to steer this waterlogged ship towards that land. And what he's trying to do is run it aground because he knows it's going to sink. So he's just going to sail it as close to this island that he can. And he ends up, running up on a reef between a half mile and a mile out from shore. What he's run into is the only possible place in the gigantic expanse of the northern Atlantic that could possibly save him, and that's the Bermuda Archipelago. Nobody lives on these islands, hundreds of islands, some big, some little, completely surrounded by really dangerous reefs. So dangerous that all mariners in the 17th century avoid Bermuda. They call it the Devil's Island. They actually think that they've heard the calls of devils from the islands, and certainly metaphorically it's a Devil's Island because people just go there to die because the ships will get wrecked on the reefs. So nobody lives there. The Spanish at some point had put a couple, put some pigs down on the islands, which the Spanish did wherever they went. They would put, first thing they would do is land pigs there, so that if they ever wanted to colonize that place, there'd be a giant supply of pigs. But otherwise, there's no human habitation, nothing about humanity there at all. Everybody gets ashore. 153 people. Not a single person is lost in this shipwreck. They all get ashore after 3 days and 3 nights of fighting the storm, without sleep, largely without food. They get onto the beach, and they blink at each other in the sunlight as the storm dissipates, and then they have to immediately begin to think, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to survive? And we have some records about what a number of people started doing.
Tell us a little bit how they survived.
So Admiral Summers, who it's the Bermuda Islands are briefly called the Summers Islands because of him. He takes some sailors and he starts fishing in the lagoon. They've essentially crashed onto a reef that is the outer edge of a big lagoon, and he discovers that there's fish aplenty. So he's fishing to supply food for people. The Governor Thomas Gates, immediately tries to start establishing his authority, and the first thing that the charter tells him to do when he gets to Jamestown. Now, of course, he didn't get to Jamestown, but he's going to enact it here. The first thing he's supposed to do is establish a corps de garde. He's going to muster a bunch of the gentlemen who are on the ship to become his personal guard. So these are the people who are going to be armed, and these are the people who are going to guard the supplies, not only the food supplies, but the armory. So he does that. He establishes it. So the very first thing he does is pretty much establish his military domination. But also from the very beginning, the commoners, we don't know exactly what they did. We can just speculate through some circumstantial evidence. They were probably pretty much doing what they were told the first couple of days. But here's the question that I tried to raise earlier that I want to raise now. Two of the women who were on the ship, they are, one is a mistress, one is a maid, and they have suffered through the shipwreck. They have gone through that shock and immersion psychological experience that I talked about, and now they're entering into the salvage stage. And I'm wondering, the mistress is named Horton, Mistress Horton, and her maid is Elizabeth Parsons. And what happens on the morning of the first day? After they sleep off this 3-day fight with the storm, they wake up the next day, under the open sky on the beach or just off the beach. What does Elizabeth Parsons, the maid, do? Is the first thing that she does is look to attend to her mistress's needs, or is the first thing that she does attend to her own needs? We don't know what she did. I mean, no one recorded that kind of thing. But in general, we know that what begins to happen is people like Elizabeth Parsons begin to attend to their own needs. They stop doing what they're told. Okay. This, of course, outrages the governor. En masse, the sailors don't do what they're told. As a matter of fact, there's something of a rebellion among the sailors as the admiral is off trying to map the islands and map where the reefs are and that kind of figure out how to get in and out. So he takes a small boat and some of his sailors to do that, but the bulk of sailors are left then at the main camp on the very northeastern edge of Bermuda on St. George Island now is what it's called. And one of those sailors kills another one. We don't know why. He hits him in the back of the head with a shovel. So it probably happened while they were, I don't know, digging post holes to erect huts or something like that. It seems to have been an active impulse, but there clearly was some history behind this event. The guy's name is Henry Waters, John Waters, and the governor takes him into custody and immediately pronounces this a murder, and he's going to be executed in the morning. So he chains him to a tree and sets up some of his own guard to guard him. And the rest of the sailors are upset by this. They think that there's extenuating circumstances. We don't know what the full story of this homicide was, but apparently the sailors are outraged that the death penalty has been visited upon this guy. So they actually they liberate him. And it seems that whoever was set to guard him either pretended to fall asleep or fell asleep. Somehow this happens. The governor is amazed that it was able to happen. It is impossible to believe there was not some collusion going on there. But the sailors spirit this guy into the woods in open defiance of the governor. And that immediately begins this kind of battle between the governor, his corps de garde, and the settlers versus the sailors. When the admiral comes back, he agrees with the sailors that this guy should not be executed. So there's this power play going on between the governor and the admiral. No one really knows who's in charge because they're not in Virginia, where the governor is supposed to have his authority. Eventually what happens is the admiral takes the sailors off to another island. So, this is like an episode of Survivor, where you have two different tribes or whatever they call them in Survivor who are competing with each other. So he goes off to another island with 30 of his own sailors while the governor stays on this first island that they landed on. And he's got his corps de garde and he's got the other settlers. And the other settlers watch the sailors disappear. And they're a little envious of it, because they don't like what really begins to happen within the first couple months under Governor Gates. And what happens is that he decides, okay, what we have to do is build a ship and sail to Jamestown. And the commoners are looking around at Bermuda. As I said, there's fish aplenty. There's fowl. They're nesting birds all over. They can just go. They stick out their arms and the birds land on them and they can just pluck them, for their food or harvest eggs just from the ground nests of these birds. There's swine enough to eat barbecue for 100 years. They realize very quickly that they are living in paradise. And from what the sailors have told them, they know that Jamestown, rather than being a utopia, is a dystopia. So the commoners, the settlers, decide that they want to stay where they are. They want to stay in Bermuda. And the governor doesn't want that to happen. It gets to the point where he basically has to, at gunpoint, require them to work on a ship that he's building to sail them to Jamestown. So he's taking the wreckage of the Sea Venture and they're chopping down the Bermuda cedars and they're, hewing lumber out of those cedars that is going to build the ship. And there's actually a replica of the ship that they built in Bermuda. If you go and look at it, it's just unbelievable. It's remarkable that these castaways were able to build this ship. It's nowhere near the size of the Sea Venture, but it is pretty darn. It's a major industrial undertaking. And they're basically doing it with hand tools. I mean, that's what they're doing. So this is backbreaking hard labor. And the settlers realize that the labor they're engaging on, at least from their point of view, they're essentially building their own coffin. They are going to get on the ship and sail to Jamestown, where half of them are probably going to die, and the rest are going to want to defect to the Indians. So they malinger. They try not, they try to avoid this work as much as possible. So gradually ratcheting up the coercion, we get to the point, and this is after a couple out and out, what would be described by the Virginia Company as mutinies, and what would be described by the people who perpetrate these as attempts to establish their own liberty. That happens a couple times, and the governor foils it, but it gets to the point where these are basically slave labor gangs that have overseers, and the overseers are drawn from this corps de garde that the governor has established. In the morning, there's a muster call, and you have to go and be counted. And then you go off in your work gang. And then at the end of the day, you come back, and there's another roll call to make sure no one snuck off into the woods. It's a slave labor camp is the only way to really describe it, is the accurate way to describe it. So they get shipwrecked in July. By the time we get to late fall, November, December, it's very clear to the settlers that they are a slave labor force. And they expect when they finish the ship and sail to Jamestown that they're going to continue to be a slave labor force in Virginia, and they're going to be worked to death. So their expectation is if they continue doing what they're doing, they are building their own coffin. So the third of the, well, it depends on how you count. If you count the sailors as kind of a mutiny, this would be the third kind of open defiance out of 4 or 5 mutinies that take place within 10 months in Bermuda. This third one is led by a guy named Stephen Hopkins. And I describe him as the most important founding father that nobody has ever heard of. The reason he's the most important figure among these commoners in Bermuda is because we actually have his words recorded, because the narrative that tells the story, this whole magnificent, fantastic story of shipwreck and maroonage in Bermuda, it's told to us by a guy named William Strachey, who essentially becomes the governor's secretary. So he's telling the story from the point of view of the Virginia Company. He's a down and out gentleman who's trying to restore his fortunes by going to Virginia. He's an acquaintance of William Shakespeare. He's in the literary circles in London and in the English Renaissance. Really interesting figure in his own right. But he's telling the story, and he tells the story of Stephen Hopkins' conspiracy in order to indict Stephen Hopkins in the view of his readers. But in doing so, what he's done is recorded what Stephen Hopkins actually was arguing in Bermuda. Now, so we have some of the actual words. So Stephen Hopkins started explaining to the other shipwrecked settlers that they were no longer beholden to the government of any man. This is the language that he uses. And his reasoning is that they had contracted with the Virginia Company to be delivered to Virginia. And the Virginia Company did not do that. Now, I mean, it's not their fault. They ran into a hurricane, but the fact of the matter is they got shipwrecked on this island, that is unoccupied island owned by no government, not even occupied by any natives. And therefore, the very fact of the shipwreck, that moment of immersion that I've been describing from using the language of Stephen Mentz, that has dissolved the contract, as if the salt water of the shipwreck has dissolved their contract with the Virginia Company, because the Virginia Company did not stand up to its end of the bargain. Therefore, the contract was null and void. And what that made them was what you and I would call political free agents. They were living in territory that was governed by nobody. They could do whatever they want. They could enter into some new contract of mutual consent. And it's this phrase, mutual consent, that William Strachey uses with the expectation that his readers, when they know that Stephen Hopkins thinks that government derives from the consent of the governed, that is going to be a prima facie demonstration of his villainy. When for you and I, of course, what that means is he's the hero of this tale, right? But he's never been cast as the hero of this tale. I don't understand why. So he is whispering into the ear of the other commoners the foundational truths that prop up our democracy today. That the notion that government derives its authority from the mutual consent of the people that are being governed. I mean, these are ideas that are enshrined in the Declaration of Independence a couple hundred years, 250 years later, or 150 years later. I'm sorry. So he's whispering this, and we know by mid-January he has established a network of co-conspirators that is a majority of the settlers. There's some gentlemen who are involved in this, and certainly most of the commoners want to just sneak away from the camp and go to another island and establish their own colony in that island, and they will live in Bermuda, and they will establish an English colony in Bermuda, and the government that is going to rule their colony is going to be something that they have agreed on together. Now, the governor gets wind of this. They invite two people too many into this conspiracy, and those two people go and rat them out. And the governor gets wind of it. He summons one of these musters of the whole camp. Everybody is called out to an assembly of their camp, and Stephen Hopkins is thrown in irons and dragged in front of this crowd, and these witnesses come to publicly declaim what he had been whispering in their ears. And William Strachey's recording this stuff, and the governor, he's judge and jury, right? He says, "Okay, you're guilty. You're sentenced to death." He says, "Okay, you're going to be executed tomorrow," and he basically reduces Stephen Hopkins to begging for his life, which he does. A humiliating end to this particular conspiracy. He discredits Stephen Hopkins in the eyes of all his followers because he's a broken man. So he spares him. The governor spares him. He does not execute him. Executions will come later, but not at this moment. So Stephen Hopkins recants and says, you're going to make my wife a widow and my children orphans if you kill me, etc. And he's shown mercy, and he doesn't continue speaking. Right? He doesn't. The conspiracy ends. Two more times, the same conspiracy is going to erupt again, and the last time, people actually do escape out into the woods. And there's a protracted, I'm not going to get into details of it right now for the podcast, but there's a protracted negotiation between the governor to get these people to come back out of the woods. And all this stuff is done in the language of contracts. So what I'm suggesting, and I think the evidence really points to this, is that what's happening in Bermuda especially, Jamestown as well, but in Bermuda especially, is that people are thinking about their government in terms of a social contract. It is literally a contract. They don't use the term social contract, but all those ideas that are going to be pioneered by Thomas Hobbes and John Locke in the coming generations are being experimented with, and some of the language is being experimented with in Bermuda. So when Thomas Hobbes eventually comes up with his theory about the formation of government, it's posited on this notion of what humanity is like in the state of nature. And he actually says, man has never been in the state of nature across the entire globe, but we can look at the New World and see how Indians live and see an approximation of what the state of nature was. Now, people have criticized him for, and I think rightly, for saying, Native Americans actually had pretty high and sophisticated states of government that are so far from what Hobbes and Locke describe as the state of nature that they're not really the same. Even this is a misunderstanding on the part of both Hobbes and Locke. But what's happening in Bermuda is literally what Hobbes is describing. This is what Stephen Hopkins is arguing. When we set foot on shore in Bermuda, we were living in the state of nature, right? And we can enter into a government of mutual consent, something that we can, or we could refuse to enter into it, and we can go off on our own and try to live off the land. As a matter of fact, they have examples. The two Indians who were on the ship did exactly that. As soon as they got on shore, they disappeared into the woods, and they're living off the land. They have opted out of whatever government is established on the beach. So Bermuda is the experiment. This is where people are actually living out what is only going to be theorized, in 1640s and then in the 1680s with Hobbes and Locke, and they're actually experimenting with it with their bodies. Now, eventually, what happens? I mean, it's tragic. I mean, what happens in Bermuda is the governor wins. All of these mutinies are put down, but the idea is planted, right? And everybody's thinking in these terms of mutual consent. They build the ship. They actually build two ships. The sailors built a ship on their own island, and the governor built a ship on his island. And at gunpoint, they are made to get on those ships. And they sail, it takes them about 8 days, and they get to the Chesapeake. They sail into the harbor. They come up to Jamestown, and their expectation, the governor's expectation is, finally, after 10 months of being marooned in this desert island, now I'm going to come and take possession of this colony. It's going to be a thriving place because the other ships have certainly gotten there. And I'm going to take possession of my governorship, right? What they find, they get to Jamestown and they come out and, half living skeletons are coming out of the houses saying, we starve, we starve. Jamestown is in the midst of the starving time. The mismanagement and the failure of the sea venture with its supplies to get to Jamestown, and I haven't even talked at all about the whole gigantic narrative thread of John Smith, but the near execution of John Smith and his exile back to England has contributed to the mismanagement of Jamestown. And when these survivors of shipwreck in Bermuda get to Jamestown, they discover they are not going to be rescued, that they have become the rescuers. So they are what ends the starving time. Now, originally, so they get there, and the worst fears of the commoners, who wanted to establish their own government in Bermuda, have come to life, right? They look around Jamestown, and the fences are falling down. There's nobody manning the cannons. People are starving. They're eating each other. I mean, this is how miserable it has become. So this is even worse than what the sailors told them it was going to be like. And so they're, imploring the governor to say, we got to abandon this place. Even the governor's own corps de garde are they're at the point where saying, this looks, we're not going to be able to survive here. And the governor says, let's give it a go for 2 weeks. Let's see if I can find food and establish it. And if I don't, then we'll sail back to England. They're actually going to sail up the coast to the fisheries around Newfoundland and hope that some English fishing boats will rescue them. They look for 2 weeks. They can't find food. So finally the governor consents. Gates says, okay, we're just going to have to abandon the colony. So they leave Jamestown. And the commoners want to burn the place down. That's their, if we burn this place down, there's no way they're going to make us come back here. That we'll know we have made our escape if we burn it down. And the governor, his one success is he succeeds in preventing them from burning Jamestown down. So they get on their ships, they leave Jamestown, and they start sailing out to the mouth of the harbor. And lo and behold, at that moment, the fourth resupply arrives.
Classic.
The fourth resupply. Yeah. I mean, it's just this is one of those coincidences I'm talking about. If they had left 3 days earlier, they would have got up the coast. They would have never seen these ships. They would have escaped. But instead, it brings a new governor, this guy, Lord Delaware, where we get Delaware from. And he brings with him a private army. He is, he's a high level aristocrat. He's got a lot of money. He's got enough money to bankroll his own, his own gang, basically, 50 halberdiers come in with him in uniform, in his uniform, right? They make everybody go back to Jamestown, and Jamestown is literally a slave colony at that point, because there are enough supplies to meet their immediate needs, and there's enough firepower for the governor to establish whatever kind of authority he wants to establish, which he does immediately. So there's a couple more, rebellions or mutinies, whatever you want to call them. I would call them, attempts at escape that take place within the next year. Most spectacularly, there's one where we have dozens of people who are up near present-day Virginia. They're up at what's called the Falls. I mean, it's basically the highest navigable part of the James River. And they are meant to be digging in iron mines, trying to, sorry for that ring there. They're digging up rocks to try to extract iron ore. So they're basically, they're like the Spanish slaves in Hispaniola or in Peru who are working mines, right? And they try to escape to the Indians and some of them make it, but some of them don't. And the ones that don't are publicly tortured and executed, some in agonizingly slow fashion, in order to terrorize the rest of the settlers. So it becomes very clear by 1611, that what Jamestown is literally a slave labor camp. And some people escape and some don't.
Why were there mutinies? There were so many of them, but none of them were ever successful, even though they had the numbers. Yeah. Why weren't they successful?
Yeah. Well, there's it depends on how you define success too. Because a lot of people did succeed in disappearing into the wilderness, and we have no idea what happened to them. So some people did escape and became Maroons in that old sense of escaped slaves. And we presume they went and lived in Indian villages, and whenever any Europeans came around, they ducked into the woods so they wouldn't be caught. So of course they disappear from the historical record. The others, they didn't succeed because the Virginia Company had the guns. I mean, it really comes down to that. They had it in Bermuda. I mean, in almost each of these waves of settlement, the proportion of gentleman to commoner was extraordinarily high. And of course, one of the things that distinguishes a gentleman from a commoner is gentleman, even in this late day, tends to be trained in the military arts. Right. That's one of the things that distinguishes a gentleman from a commoner. You can walk around London with a sword on your hip if you're a gentleman, and you literally have a coat of arms. I mean, that's what distinguishes you from other people. Now, I know by this time people are buying coats of arms. There's merchants who are getting them and that kind of thing. But by and large, if you're a gentleman, you probably have some military training. And in England, the proportion of the gentry, the people who are gentlemen or higher, basically the lower aristocracy up through dukes and earls and the king, is 2%. So 98% of England is commoner, 2% is gentlemen. The proportions are closer to 50-50% in these, in each of the waves of these settlers. Now, those gentlemen have bought shares not only in their person, but they have bought shares literally with money. So they are invested in the success of the Virginia Company in a way that the commoners are not. The commoners are just trying to get a better way of life. They're hoping to get some land. Their expectation, this is not an investment where they're going to get a return and go back to England and restore the family fortunes. They're going to the New World to establish a new life. So they have, less of a tie back to the old world than the gentlemen. The gentlemen have greater ties to the success of the Virginia Company, and the Virginia Company recognizes this and gives them privileges that it doesn't give the commoners and that kind of thing. I go into this a fair amount in the book, but so you have high proportion of people who are gentlemen. Now, this is not to say all the gentlemen identify with the Virginia Company, after they realize the disaster that the colony is. Some of them do go along with these schemes of mutual consent, these schemes of escape. But for the most part, they stick with the company, and they are the ones with the guns. They are the ones with the swords. So it is coercion, that makes the coercion and terror that prevents these rebellions from succeeding, these mutinies from getting the kind of traction they might otherwise get. So that's literally what it is. It's force of arms. The proportions aren't good enough, and I mean, one of the last big rebellion that was planned in Bermuda, which happened after they saw Stephen Hopkins' humiliation, the next rebellion was going to actually seize the arms that were in the armory. And they had some gentlemen who were part of the conspiracy, and they were going to seize those arms. Even then, they weren't going to kill the governor or anything. They were just going to take those arms and go off to an island and establish their own colony, but they would have a means of defense then. But that one gets, it kind of gets triggered before it should have, and gets foiled because of that reason. But it's because the governor has got more weapons on his side and people willing to use them, that it doesn't succeed ultimately.
Yeah, to me, like the whole Jamestown thing, reading, I just kept thinking to myself, wow, this is a lot like Game of Thrones. There's power struggles. There's abuse.
Oh my God. Yeah. So one of the things that it's amusing to me that you bring that up, because, part of this book was written on a sabbatical I had a couple of years ago. And as I'm immersing myself in all this late 16th, early 17th century political and military shenanigans, if you will, for recreation, I started reading the Game of Thrones books that my kids had been reading, right? So I read the first four, and I'm like, oh my God, this is, even the technology is somewhat about the same time period that we're talking about, So, yeah, I've got a feeling that there's some historical basis for a lot of the fantasy that's going on in the Game of Thrones stuff.
Yeah, I know George Martin wrote a lot of it on the War of Roses, and
but I think it's even later is what I'm thinking. I think he must be reading about Tudor and Jacobean England and wars in France at the end of the 16th and beginning of the 17th century as well. So. Just because, I think here's the kind of thing, I forget which book. It's been such a long time since I read them, but at one point, and spoiler alert, if you guys haven't read, Game of Thrones, but at one point, they're hurling those fire bombs in the siege of one of the castles, and God, I even forget the names of the characters. I've never seen the show, so I'm basing this all on my reading of the books. But that kind of pyrotechnics that takes place in the climax of one of the books, John Smith did that kind of thing. He in the Turkish wars, he used pyrotechnics and to help defeat the Turks in a siege, and not quite as spectacularly as it is in Game of Thrones, but not too far off. And he knew about this by studying back in England. He studied this book on pyrotechnics, and then that he drew on when he went to the Turkish wars. So, there's some connections, I think, that go deeper than coincidence.
And obviously, John Smith plays a huge part in Jamestown.
Yeah.
But it's almost like dichotomous on some level. At some points, you're rooting for him, and other points, you're like, "Wow, I hate this guy." Tell us a little about John Smith and his role there.
God, he is rightly, I think, one of the most fascinating, enduring characters in American history. And people argue over the meaning of John Smith quite a bit. And the interpretation I'm getting is probably a little different or significantly different than the way people are most used to thinking about him. In today's day and age, he's sometimes thought of as the first American, because there's some things that he does in Jamestown that suggest that he's really promoting a meritocracy. And in some ways he is. I mean, which you would think argues against the aristocracy. And very famously, at one point, he says, "He who does not work shall not eat." And this is generally interpreted as a slap at those the gentlemen who are in Jamestown who are not used to physical labor and therefore refuse to do any physical labor. That's not the way to interpret it. Really what was happening is there were two very distinct factions. There was the John Smith faction and the anti-John Smith faction. And what he meant was if those people in the anti-John Smith faction don't start doing what he's telling them to do, they don't start bowing to his authority, then they were not going to eat. That's what it was. So it was not a pronouncement of early nation's democratic ideals. It was part of his autocracy. This was part of his decree that said, you do what I tell you, and I am a tyrant, and if you don't do what I tell you, you're going to die. So in my interpretation of John Smith, he is not the first American. He is not the first guy to start establishing or voicing really anti-aristocratic, meritocratic ideals. Now, with that said, I mean, he is a complex guy. I mean, while he was tyrant, very few people died in Jamestown. He fed them. The reason he was opposed in the beginning, as a matter of fact, he arrives in Jamestown in chains under a death sentence. He thinks he's going to get hanged. I won't go into that whole story, but there's another, truth stranger than fiction tale about how he doesn't die. But from the very beginning, there are factions, and the anti-John Smith faction imagines that what he's going to do is draw a coterie of people around him among the settlers and use that coterie to establish himself as a pirate king. And so this is what he's accused of, and this is why he's in chains, that he's not going to take the orders from the Virginia Company, but he's going to do a coup d'etat and establish himself as a pirate king. What he ends up doing is not very far off from that, but he doesn't become a pirate king. He becomes a paramount chief. On the James River, he establishes what is very similar to the political structure that he finds when they arrive there. The same political structure that Powhatan, the man whose real name is Wahoo Sonnecock, who we know him as Powhatan, but that's because he was a leader of the Powhatan district. It's kind of a title, rather than a name. Wahoo Sonnecock has organized over 30 distinct districts of Algonquin Indians on the Chesapeake watershed. Pretty much the entire Chesapeake, except for the upper, the rivers in the very top, up to the southern bank of the Potomac River. He has unified all these Indians under his paramount chiefdom. So these are petty chiefdoms that all owe their allegiance to him as the paramount chief. And what John Smith does is he detaches the districts that are on the James River from the Powhatan, sometimes called the Powhatan Confederacy. And he becomes the paramount chief of all of those districts on the James River, and the Jamestown colony is one of those districts. So what happens on the James River is this really fascinating, what we would call middle ground, a different kind of culture. It's neither European nor is it Native American. And at the top, at the pinnacle of this political structure is John Smith, the person John Smith. So one of the reasons that the starving time happens is because after John Smith is ousted by the anti-John Smith faction in Jamestown, the leaders of that faction, especially a guy named Ratcliffe, think that the Indians are going to be paying tribute now to him because his gang is in charge in Jamestown. What he discovers is that those Indian districts didn't owe allegiance to Jamestown. They owed allegiance to John Smith. And when John Smith disappears, they separate themselves from Jamestown, and immediately Jamestown is isolated again. And they're getting no food getting paid in tribute to them from those districts that John Smith had more or less pacified.
Do you think that John Smith was actually going renegade? Do you actually think?
No, I don't.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't. It's and that word renegade is pretty interesting too. That they're using at the time. They think he's gone renegade, right? At least the anti-Smith faction thinks he's in cahoots with the Indians to try to kill the Europeans and establish his own kingdom. So if he were doing that, what it would look like, he would end up establishing his own kind of empire on the Chesapeake that was distinct from Virginia Company, distinct from England even. I don't think he was trying to do that. I think what he was trying to do, he imagined himself, I think, ultimately the English governor of this entire territory. And he knew the way to subdue that territory was to become kind of half Indian himself, to adapt his own political structure to the political structure that he found there, as opposed to do what the rest of the English were trying to do, is just impose, this naive notion of English politics on the Chesapeake. I mean, they actually at one point send some presents to Wahoo-Sunnicock, including a crown, thinking they're going to go through this ceremony where they place a crown on Wahoo-Sunnicock's head. And what that's going to mean is that he derives his authority from King James back in England, So there's this absurd ceremony where they're trying to get him to kneel down to receive this crown. John Smith is watching this, with an absolute and utter disbelief, watching the English try to do this. And it's this Captain Newport is a one-armed guy who's probably the height of a typical European, which is 5.5 feet tall. And here's this gigantic, magnificent old Algonquin warrior, head and shoulders standing above him, and the Englishman is trying to reach up and put a crown on his head to demonstrate that he's subservient to King James. I mean, so the English are kind of foolishly think back to that old plan. What we're going to do, we're going to come and we're going to demonstrate our superiority, and we're going to let the Indians live, but they're going to have to pay us tribute, and they're going to recognize that we're the champions of liberty and we're so much better than the Spanish. So they'll just naturally flock to our banner. Of course, that never works. People would rather live according to their own government than the manifestly, quote unquote, superior government of the invaders. Right. Mm-hmm. So John Smith realized all of the folly of all that. And he played the game according to Indian rules. And he played it really well. The guy is brilliant. I mean, he's a really fascinating character. I think ultimately what he was going to do, though, is, he was going to de facto make himself the ruler there. And once the Virginia Company recognized the utility of him, they would recognize his governorship, and they would leave him in charge. And he would gradually expand. I think he probably imagined he was going to end up ruling over territory that was bigger than England. Virginia is huge, and the actual territory that was given to the Virginia Company is magnificently large.
He understood the game, and he understood, how to play it where he was coming from. And, I think a big reason why they thought he was going to Renegades is because it seemed that he had a pretty close relationship with Pocahontas. And of course there was a big debate, why did she save him? And was their relationship sexual? I mean, where do you kind of fall in on that? And
I think, that the circumstantial evidence really points very strongly to the idea that they had a sexual relationship. I'm most persuaded by the denials of Smith's faction. He's getting accused of wanting to set himself up as this king, and so he's going to marry the Princess Pocahontas, and that's based on what people had been observing about his behavior. But Pocahontas has been coming into the Jamestown colony, and she's a favorite of John Smith. And now, of course, when he first meets her, she's prepubescent, so that it's not a real possibility in either culture. But by the time she goes through puberty, within a year and a half of after the English have arrived, so she becomes marriageable age. I mean, she's only 12 or 13, but in Algonquin culture, she's now marriageable. And she's probably having sex with people because that's what the Indians did. This is part of the appeal, I think, that we often overlook. Part of the appeal of Indian culture to these Englishmen who have arrived in this colony in the first couple of ways with no women, and they think, okay, we can starve in Jamestown, and we can go to this village and take an Indian wife and have sex with unmarried Indian women and that kind of thing. And so they're probably doing that all the time. So it would seem unusual if Pocahontas did not. And we know of one particular episode in which she basically led a group of young Algonquin women who offer themselves to the English. And John Smith becomes very quiet. He stops telling the story. It's like a fade to black in that part of the narrative. And he doesn't even, what's remarkable to me is he doesn't deny it. He doesn't say what happened. I think the circumstantial evidence suggests, I think, more strongly that they did have a sexual relationship than that they didn't. Now, there's a very compelling romantic impulse on our part to not want them to have a sexual relationship, because that changes it into a different kind of story than it was. But I think there were a lot of credible reasons for the anti-John Smith faction to think that he was in collaboration with Wahoo Sonnecock, and that he was, at some point, he was going to invite the Indians into the fort and they're going to slit the throats of all of his enemies and that kind of thing. I think that was that's what they were afraid of. And I think it was a credible fear. I don't think that he was probably going to betray the old world in that way. I think he still wanted to retain, he wanted to establish himself as a winner in the old world system. And the way he was going to do that was by, figuring out how to succeed on the Chesapeake, which was to become this new kind of man. Very different. It's clearly, he goes through a transformation. He establishes methods of warfare and government that are different from what the English are used to. So he definitely goes through this kind of transformation. But I think it's in service not of detaching himself from the old world, but of really making himself, essentially becoming a lord himself. He's going to rise up in the aristocracy. This is the thing that people don't, when they talk about John Smith, they forget the fact he was incredibly invested in the aristocracy, because he was born a commoner and he earns his stripes, so to speak. Well, literally, not so to speak, he earns his coat of arms through feat of arms. So he becomes a gentleman because of what he did in the Turkish Wars, and he really cherishes that distinction. He likes being part of the 2%. Now, he had a lot of respect for a lot of people in the 98%, but he was not going to relinquish the privilege that was given to him by being somebody who had a coat of arms.
And I think that's his story is a lot of kind of is emblematic in many ways of the story of Jamestown. Talking about abuse, power, how it can, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Abuse on the commoners and the ideas for religious freedom and governance and all of this is kind of planted in the seed with Jamestown, maybe not knowingly, but then eventually it does.
What happens after, this tragic tale that I'm telling about Jamestown, 10 years later is when the Mayflower sails off to Massachusetts. And, they sail into a storm too. They go through their trials. There's two types of people who are on that ship. There's the saints and there's the strangers. These are the terms that William Bradford, the guy that we know as the leader, the eventual governor of the Pilgrims, uses this term. So the saints are the people we know as the Pilgrims, and the strangers are the settlers who are not part of the Pilgrim faith and not part of their religious, really almost a religious cult, you would describe it. And as everybody knows, the Mayflower, it has a contract from the Virginia Company, and they're supposed to establish a colony within the territory that is ceded to the Virginia Company, and they sail further north, whether on purpose or by accident or whatever, it doesn't matter, but they know that they are in territory that has not been patented to the Virginia Company. So, as William Bradford describes it, some of the strangers among us, some malcontents, start complaining, or not complaining, but start making the argument that when they set foot on ground, they're going to be political free agents, that they can do whatever they want. They can establish whatever new government they want to establish because the Virginia Company contract doesn't apply here. That their contract has essentially been dissolved because the Mayflower is not going to deliver them where the Virginia Company said it was going to deliver them. So this argument sounds exactly like the argument that Stephen Hopkins was making in Bermuda, right? So according to William Bradford, they wrote the Mayflower Compact in order to prevent that from happening, in order to kind of short circuit the attempt by the strangers to establish their own government. And so what they end up doing is entering into a body politic through mutual consent. That's a civil body politic, is a phrase that we get from the Mayflower Compact. So this civil body compact gets written up, and 41 people sign it. And by doing that, they are establishing for the first time government by consent of the governed. Excuse me. So, and in the old way that we've heard this story, it comes to us through the words of William Bradford. So this is a great accomplishment of the Pilgrims. I think my interpretation of these events flips that 180 degrees, because the language sounds so much like the language that we have recorded that Stephen Hopkins used in Bermuda. This is essentially what he was trying to do in Bermuda, was establish a civil body politic outside the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company. And the language of the malcontents that Bradford gives is exactly like what he was arguing in Bermuda. Now, there's no surprise, it turns out, that language is so coincidental with what was happening 10 years earlier in Bermuda, because Stephen Hopkins was on the Mayflower. He was one of those 41 people who signed the Mayflower Compact. So, this has been noted before. People have recognized this, but again, this is, we have circumstantial evidence. We don't have more than that, but I think the circumstantial evidence very strongly points to the idea that Stephen Hopkins is responsible for the language that goes into the Mayflower Compact. And the very fact that they create a Mayflower Compact is because of arguments that Stephen Hopkins has been making on the Mayflower. He's one of those strangers. He's one of those malcontents. So this is why I ultimately think not only is what was happening in Virginia and Bermuda, sort of the first experiment in democracy, and that's where we should look for it, but I think there's an unbroken chain that we can trace back to Bermuda, back to Jamestown, through the person of Stephen Hopkins.
Absolutely phenomenal, amazing research. George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Stephen Hopkins. Let's throw him on there. He deserves it.
Absolutely. Yeah, there needs to be a ton of research done on this guy. People should be talking about him a lot. People should be. There's one biography that's out there right now, and it's written pretty much by, it's not a university scholar. It's an independent scholar who's done fantastic scholarship. His name's Caleb Johnson, but his biography is essentially, self-published. It's pretty good. It's laying a great groundwork for people who want to do further research. But
I know another guy named Joseph Kelly who might be able to help out there.
Yeah. My next project, I'm skipping ahead a couple hundred years. So,
is it going to be on Marooners, or what's going on?
No.
What's the next focus?
No. I'm returning to where I started in my career. I began, my first book was on James Joyce and early 20th century politics and culture, not only in Ireland but in the United States as well. So, I'm returning to that period. I'm looking at the struggle of free democracy, liberal democracy in the age of fascism. So, I've written the first few pages of this new book, which are talking about Hitler's and Mussolini's experiences in World War I and comparing them with Ernest Hemingway. And so it's going to be a story about what happens in the 1920s and the 1930s.
That's an interesting juxtaposition between two people historically. Let's just, I know I only got you for a couple minutes. Let's just wrap it up in a nice little bow. Talking about Jamestown and the Sea Venture shipwreck. I mean, one of the biggest things that I take away is that, we have the 2% versus the 98%, and the 2% seem to have the majority of the people, but they never went out. I mean, why is that? And kind of relate that to today. What are the parallels there?
Yeah. Well, they eventually went out in the American Revolution, right? I mean, that's
but it took rich white guys to want to that were fed up with other rich guys to make that happen.
Right. Well, it depends on how you interpret that revolution too. I mean, that's the way the story's been told to us. But there's there are other angles to the American Revolution that look at it as much more revolutionary than merely, trading who's at the top of the heap, but could be, interpreted as much more revolutionary economically. Now, of course, we know it ended up, solidifying unfree labor in the United States as opposed to, going in the opposite direction. So, that's something that has to be contended with. But anyway, why does the 98% always lose to the 2%? I think to a large extent, it's because portions of the 98% are through culture made to or enticed to align themselves psychologically with the 2%. We see this with to a large extent with the yeomanry in England, I think, which is kind of the upper middle class agricultural class of people. They're below the gentry, but they're the top of the heap of the 98%. Same thing with merchants in the cities who are going to identify with the who think of success as eventually owning a landed estate and looking like an aristocrat. So one thing that you do is you get the top people in the 98% to identify psychologically with you and want to look like you. What is an American country club but a fake English estate, right? That's the attempt. And here we are in an anti-aristocratic society, but the people at the top of the heap, try to adopt the trappings of the aristocracy that we left hundreds of years ago. So that's part of it. I think mere physical force is a big part of it too. You're getting a little bit out of my expertise when we start talking about how come elites have been elite for so long, and the people who are not elite have not toppled them. But it's an interesting way to pose that question is the way it was posed to Montaigne, back in mid 1500s when he watched these, what were called cannibals come into the French court, and these cannibals from the coast of South America observed the way everyone was treating the child king of France, and they turned around and said, why are people paying homage to this little kid? It makes no sense. In their view, it made no sense because it's sort of from a much from a point of view that was much closer to traditional human government as opposed to a highly artificial human government that you had in France. It looks silly, and even more telling, they ask, how come, we look around this country and we see all these starving people. How come they don't burn down the houses of the rich people? And the French smiled at them, about their naivete. But that was a pretty telling question, and Montaigne filed it away, and that's what became the seed of his essay of cannibals, and it's what became the seed of the French Revolution a couple hundred years later. So, I don't why it didn't happen earlier than it did. When we get to the age of revolutions, it certainly is happening. But I don't know. That's you're getting beyond my own expertise there.
All right, well, fair. Well, we'll keep it for the listeners to give them for food for thought for our next episode.
Yes, I'm sure they'll have a lot of ideas on how to answer that question, I think.
Professor, thank you so much for your time. We've been talking with Joseph Kelly about his book, Marooned, Jamestown, Shipwrecked, and a New History of America's Origin. Professor, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thanks for giving me so much time. I appreciate that opportunity to talk to your listeners.
The Mind's Eye wrap-up when we return. This is The Mind's Eye on Z-Talk Radio and Stitcher Radio. This show was kind of like our Howard Zinn episode. I'm hoping that we did justice to all the sides, to the native people, the first true Americans, to the English settlers and the commoners. We even got a new founding father in Stephen Hopkins. Myth-making, myth-breaking, giving voice to the voiceless. That's what The Mind's Eye is all about. We'll continue that same trend next week as we speak with former cult members, sociologist Dr. Janja Lalich, and award-winning author Carla McLaren. Both of them will share their experiences as former cult members, and we'll talk about their book, Escaping Utopia, Growing Up in a Cult, Getting Out, and Starting Over. The two of them will share their first-of-a-kind, in-depth research of people who were born in or grew up in a cult, but left on their own without any outside help or internal support. It's going to be a really interesting show. More info about the show on themindseyemedia.com, themindseyemedia.com. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for subscribing. Until we meet again, be well and let well be. I'm DJ BJ Turnov signing off for The Mind's Eye on Z Talk Radio and Stitcher Radio.